everybody, this is Blake here. I'm going to be reviewing Dredd. But before I get into that, because everybody wants to know, am I going to review To Boldly Flee? The answer is yes. I should be releasing that review all throughout this week. It'll be a 4-parter. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm finally happy with the script. So hopefully that will be a lot of fun, and I shall enter production as soon as I'm done with this video. The second question is, what do I think about the Nostalgia Critic retiring? Well, I've decided to leave it to you guys how I should approach that. Should I include that as just part of my To Boldly Flee review, or should I re-review the Nostalgia Critic in honor of him retiring that character and discuss it there? So if you go to the description, there's a link that leads to a poll, and you could vote choosing what I should do about that. But for the 3 people who are actually interested in my opinion on Dredd, here we go. I'm not familiar with the comic books. They sound really interesting. I've read about them, and I have a few friends who really enjoy those comics, and they recommend them enthusiastically. So maybe I will give them a look, but I have no loyalty to the comic books whatsoever. So I didn't hate the 1995 Judge Dredd movie for that reason. Is it particularly good? No, it's kind of a mess. If anything, I'd say it's an interesting failure. A lot of money was put into it, so some of the sets are really awesome, and the CGI was cutting edge for the time, but you know, the problem with that level of CGI is it hasn't aged very well, as was the case with all 90s movies that hoard CGI like that. And I felt there was something very 90s about the Judge Dredd movie. You know, it had that stupid comic relief sidekick that all 90s movies like that seem to have. And in this case, it was played by Rob Schneider before we realized how annoying Rob Schneider was. And he is just as annoying in that movie as he is in all of his movies. So that was a major flaw. It was one of those films, I mean, it was ambitious when it came to its visuals and its ideas, but it just didn't really pull it off. So in the end, the movie was almost in so bad it's good territory, but it had some legitimately good stuff about it and some noticeably bad stuff about it. So, you know, I enjoyed it, but I wouldn't call myself a major fan of that one either. So when they announced that they were going to reboot Dredd, and it was going to be in 3D, and it was going to be closer to the source material, I really didn't give a shit. I think comic book fans are actually very unreasonable. Comic books have their own set of rules, and movies have their own set of rules. They are 2 different mediums and should be treated as such. What comic book fans, I don't think, realize is that what works in a comic book won't necessarily work in a movie. Whether it's the costume or, for example, one thing that really bothered me was how people were complaining how Dredd wasn't Dredd. He develops, whereas in the comic book he was more of a symbol, caricature, if anything. But that gets boring in a movie. It just doesn't work. And like then shit like he takes off his helmet. Okay, that's a nitpick, but I thought that was just stupid. I mean, there's so many other things to complain about with that movie. Why complain about that? Because, let's face it, at that time, people weren't going to see it because it was a comic book adaptation. They were going to see it because it was a Stallone action movie. And if he kept the helmet on the entire time, more people, I think, would have complained that, you know, they didn't get to see Sylvester Stallone in all his glory. So, take that as you will, but since I'm not a follower of the comic books, that I don't really give a shit. And it seemed like the studio was just out to make a quick buck with this one because they weren't putting a whole lot of money into it. In fact, I think it had less of a budget than the 1995 movie, and movies cost a lot more now than they did back then. Although granted, that was a pretty big budgeted movie for its time. But this one, I think it just cost like $45 million. Not too impressive. They got Carl Urban to play Judge Dredd. Okay, that's cool. I like Carl Urban, but at the same time, he was in an Uwe Boll movie, which I think makes me concerned about whatever he does, because I don't know if it's going to be good for that reason alone. I believe that if you do an Uwe Boll movie, you're just in it for the money. So I don't trust you. So once again, take that as you will. When they started releasing the trailers, they didn't really look all that exciting to me. I mean, it could have been fun, but most of the time I kept expecting the trailer to reveal something awesome, but it never does. The action just looked okay. The plot looked like they pretty much stole it from The Raid, which actually turns out to be untrue. Actually, if anything, The Raid probably stole the plot from Dredd. But it's a thin plot to begin with, so who the fuck cares? you know, like he'd say some really cheesy dialogue that you think is going to become witty and interesting, but it's not. Like he says, "Are you ready?" and she's like, "Yeah, you look ready." Well, I was expecting him to say something significantly cooler than that. But much to my surprise, when it finally was being released overseas, like America, for some reason, is the last place any movie gets released these days. People really started liking it. You know, people were praising it as one of the best action movies to come out in the last decade. So obviously my expectations started getting really high, and it did not meet those expectations. But it is still a very good movie. It was very entertaining. You know, it's not as ambitious or even as intelligent as the previous film, which I'm a little iffy about calling it intelligent. But it is a very simple but incredibly badass action film. It is very visceral, very bloody, very stylish, but not too stylish. It has its own brand of action that I really appreciate, and it never really lets up on that action. It gets going from almost the first scene, never really slows down, but at the same time, it's not too fast-paced either. It never runs out of steam. What I like about the action is that it takes all these different kinds of action styles and just pretty much throws them together. For example, sometimes the film is very nonchalant about its violence. You know, it's just part of its world. It's a very unpleasant place to live. So some of the violent sequences just come out of nowhere and you don't expect them. And the movie doesn't linger on them either, which almost makes them even more unsettling. For example, in the very first chase sequence, the bad guys just randomly run over a good guy or just a passerby. And it just comes out of nowhere, so you're not expecting it. But then the movie never really is that sleazy about it either. So it's just like, whoa, I wasn't expecting that. And the movie is filled with tidbits like that. But then on the other hand, there are times where it really exploits the violence. Like you'll see in slow motion a bullet ripping through some dude's cheek, and you can see the insides of his face, and it's all fucked up. But there's almost a dreamlike quality about it. So even though it's very CGI, it works. So when you combine that, it just made the violence very unpredictable. It really culminates in the final kill of the movie, where you're expecting either this is going to be the most graphic part in the whole film, or they're going to cop out like most movies do, which can be actually more effective, where you don't really see the extent of the violence. I'm not going to reveal what it is. But no, it was neither. They actually handled that in a surprisingly artistic and unique way. So, like, even though the story offers nothing, visually the film is it is pretty creative. Now, if I were to talk about the action in general, I'm going to compare it to two recent action films, The Expendables 2 and Resident Evil Retribution. Now, whether those were good movies or not are irrelevant. I thought the action was good in both of them. So I'm not criticizing any style of action, I'm just making a comparison. So with like Resident Evil, it was very stylized, it was almost over the top in terms of style. So you'd have lots of wire work, lots of CGI, lots of slow motion, the camera's constantly moving in, zooming out, moving around, whatever. It was very detailed in its action. Whereas The Expendables 2 was more simplified in its action. It would show like an explosion or a gunfight, and pretty much the director would just make sure it's framed properly, but it wasn't like too excessive when it came to post-production effects or whatever, besides the CGI gore. But with those movies, like with The Expendables, and the 80s movies in general were like this. It was more about who was causing the mayhem than the mayhem itself. So it was more about Stallone and Schwarzenegger blowing shit up than the shit that was getting blown up. So I like both of those brands, you know, if done right. This one is in the middle. It's not quite as over the top as Resident Evil, but there is more, I'm trying to think what to say. There's more, I don't want to say effort put into the action, the Expendables 2, but it's more detailed. So there is a lot more slow motion. There's some real trippy colors. I really like the coloring in this movie. It was very hallucinogenic, very bizarre. And the sets were really cool, but they weren't like also over the top. You know, they're fairly simple. It's weird because I think the landscape shots were much more interesting in this movie than what we got in Total Recall, the remake, where, I mean, that movie had like 3 times the budget as this one. And but this just had a much more interesting world, I should say. There was a lot cooler props. a lot more interesting in terms of the sound department. It was just an all-around exciting, action-packed movie, and the action was very well done. But as I said, I like how the action in itself was fairly unique. You never knew what to expect from it. But it's also, very gritty, very violent. It's what all action fans really want out of an action movie. But if you're expecting any substance here, you're not going to get it. There's no there is some character development, but it's not coming from Dredd. It's coming from the supporting chick, the rookie. Dredd, for the most part, is a pretty accurate representation of the comics from what I hear. He's a static character. He has no real personality. There's no depth to him. And he's just there to cause mayhem and shoot people. But the girl develops a little bit, but for the most part, there's no love story, there's no backstory, there's no thematic material. They occasionally try to bring up the theme of, what happens if the cops, which are the judges, have too much power. But they don't really explore that much. It's only like maybe one or two scenes that kind of allude to it. It's more like hints that this movie might be smarter than what it really is, but it's not. Actually, that's one thing. The 1995 film did a better job, I think, of exploring that. But this movie, it didn't really want to explore that. It just kind of acknowledges it, then moves on to the next action set piece. And unlike Resident Evil Retribution, it never stumbles over its narrative. It's never incredibly stupid. It's just a real simple action film. The script is just there to serve the action. But I was never like, okay, that makes no sense, or that's just stupid. Really, I didn't notice the script at all. The dialogue was fine, but nothing too good or nothing that was incredibly bad. The plot, there's no holes that I noticed. My only real complaint there is I felt the villain became too much of a pushover. At first, she's terrifying. You think that, she might kill Judge Dredd. Well, you don't really think that, but, she's a worthy threat. But as time goes on, it becomes more apparent that she doesn't stand a chance. But otherwise, I thought the script was acceptable. It just was there not to get in the way of the action. And the action was really good. So yeah, I thought it was a success. I actually would say that even though it's not as ambitious as the previous film, it is more focused. It's less, there's less criticisms I could level at it. It's just a harmless action movie at the absolute least. An awesome action movie at best. So if you are a fan of hardcore action like this, definitely give it a look. If the idea of an action movie that is nothing but action doesn't really interest you, then I wouldn't bother. The acting is fine, but for the most part, nothing really stood out there. Carl Urban, he's playing Dredd, how he's supposed to be played, I guess. So once again, take that as you will. I do not follow the comics. I don't hate the 1995 movie. I just saw this as a pretty cool action film that does its own thing. So definitely give it a look if you like action films. I'd say if you are into these types of movies, yeah, it's probably worth watching at full price. If you're a little iffy on it, watch it as a matinee. But if it doesn't sound appealing to you at all, don't bother. So if you'd like to read my written review, please check the link in my description. Once again, vote to see if I re-review The Nostalgia Critic or not. That is it. I'll see you guys later.